job is to persuade you of one thing, but it's one thing that none of us actually want to believe. I want to persuade you that good intentions are not good enough. Now, what am I saying when I say that? Because as Christians, we know that God cares about our intentions. But we ought to know, we ought to understand that God cares what we do as well. In the moral life, the internal matters. But in our economic and public life, especially when we're thinking about things like economics and public policy, it's the external that matters. So such an important point. There was a great thinker named Henry Hazlitt in the 1950s, wrote a book called Economics in One Lesson. In that book, this is what he said. He talked about what he called the art of economics. The art of economics, he said, consists in tracing the consequences of a policy not merely for one group, but for all groups. And thinking through not just what we intend to do, but what actually happens. That's the key. Now you're thinking, okay, well, but as Christians, why would we want to learn the art of economics? Are you saying, Jay Richards, that we need to take macroeconomics and econometrics? No. Notice Hazlitt is talking about what he calls the art of economics, not the science of economics. An art is different from a science. There are rules and principles that, of course, we have to develop. But as an art, it's something that we have to get down in our bones, that we get down in our marrow, so that it's something that we're accustomed to and that we do automatically. That's the art of economics. Now, if we can master that, I would maintain, if we can just learn the intellectual disciplines of the art of economics, we can learn how to help rather than unintentionally harming people, both in our public lives, in our missions, in our development work, and in the economic policies and the political policies that we actually advocate. There's also a biblical point here. Hazlitt's the economist. The biblical point is one I already alluded to, and it's there is a difference between our moral lives and our economic lives. In our moral lives, God cares both what we do and why we do it. That's one of the points of the story of the widow's mite. You'll remember the widow's mite. Jesus and the disciples are in the temple, and they're watching people gaudy displays of their wealth and of their generosity. And he sees the widow give just a mere mite, something like, think of it as a penny. And Jesus praised her. He didn't praise her because of the economic significance of her gift. He praised her because she gave out of her poverty. In other words, he praised her because of the love that she had and her willingness to sacrifice. That's the point in the moral life. God cares when you act. You can do something that could actually help someone, but if you do it out of greed, if you do it out of pride, you won't have done it for the right reason, and it turns what would otherwise be a moral act into an immoral one. That's true in the moral life. It's not true in the economic life. In economic policies, if members of Congress vote on, let's say, a bill, and 535 members of the House and Senate unanimously support a bill and the president signs it, that policy is going to have the same effect, even if there were 535 different motivations for supporting the bill. If you can understand and remember that point, you will have mastered the art of economics. Unfortunately, a really simple idea to understand and think through the unintended consequences of actions is something that's very difficult to practice. It's easy to get, and it's very easy to forget. So many of the things that we do as a country, the war on poverty, the things that we do collectively, the things we do as Christians, unfortunately, very often are motivated well. They have good intentions, but they actually do counterintuitive and counterproductive things to people. Let me give you just a couple of examples. I could drone on about this all night, and trust me, it would be very depressing. But I just want to give you a couple of mental hooks to remember this lesson about intentions. The first is something that's actually not probably common in places like Wake Forest, North Carolina, but in large municipalities, in large cities, cities, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, actually implemented a policy called rent control. Now, what rent control essentially is it sets a legal limit on how much landlords can charge for their property. So you've got a one-bedroom apartment or two-bedroom apartment. The city tells you that it's illegal to charge above a certain amount. And that's rent control. Now, why would city councils, why would they want something like this? Well, inevitably, the reason these policies are implemented is because city councils look around. If you're in a large city like London or Manhattan or San Francisco, you discover that the price of housing is going through the roof. There's a lot of demand, there's not a lot of space, supply and demand relate in a certain way, and so prices go up. City council looks around and says, very quickly, rental housing in our city is going to be unaffordable for lower income people. So the thought is, okay, well, we'll just make it illegal for landlords to charge above a certain amount, and then we'll keep housing affordable. So what's the motivation? To keep housing affordable for lower income people. What's the effect, do you think, of rent control whenever it's tried in this kind of context? It is to create a shortage in the very housing that was intended to be protected. And you get this, all you have to do is actually just think about it from the perspective of a landlord. Let's say you have a 10-room apartment complex with 10 one-bedroom apartments, and it costs you $1,000 a month to maintain it. And the city tells you you can only charge $500 a month for rent. Well, what are you going to do unless you sort of like self-torture, right, or like going bankrupt? You're going to do one of three things. You'll either convert the residential property to commercial property so it becomes a store. You'll convert it into a condominium and sell it so it's no longer rent property. Or you'll quit maintaining it so you don't lose money and then it eventually becomes a slum and you become a slumlord. In every case, just the lack of attention to the unintended consequences of policy. They not only had weird kind of counterintuitive consequences, they ended up doing exactly the opposite of what they were supposed to do. If you remember just that one thing, you'll actually get the point. If you fail to attend to the actual consequences of a policy, you could end up doing exactly the opposite of what you meant to do. One more example. The Endangered Species Act was a bipartisan act passed in the United States in 1973. It was signed by President Richard Nixon. And at the time, it put about 1,200 animals, various animals and plants that were considered endangered on the list. And essentially what this was is that scientists surveyed different populations of plants and animals and determined whether certain animals or plants were at risk or were endangered or were very endangered, and then set up certain laws to try to protect them. The purpose of the act, obviously, it's called the Endangered Species Act, right? It's not to make species endangered, if you think that's what it was. It was to protect endangered species. That's the point of the policy. I have no doubt that's exactly all the people that supported the act, that was their motivation, and all the people that voted for the act, that was their motivation. But if you've learned the art of economics, you know that there's more to it than that. You know that especially with a federal policy, there are all sorts of opportunities for weird and counterintuitive consequences. Weird things that you might not have thought would happen. And in this very large act, as it turns out, there's one little provision called the takings provision that has ended up more or less reversing and perverting, I think, the laudable goals of the Endangered Species Act. Now, what the taking provision says is this. Let's say you're a farmer or a landowner, and you discover an endangered species habitat on your farm. If you report it, the takings provision allows a federal agency to essentially take that portion of your land. Not literally, but they essentially prohibit you from using that portion of your land because it's an endangered habitat. It's a habitat for endangered species. That's the takings provision. Now, just for a few seconds, I want you to think about the potential unintended consequence of this policy. Imagine, for instance, that you are a farmer who live by the sweat of your brow on the land that you farm. And you are in western Pennsylvania and you discover wild lupin growing. And it's wild, so it's growing wildly in certain portions of your farm that you allow to go fallow for a few years. And every year you let a different portion of your farm go fallow and then you'll farm it later. And when that happens, this wild lupin grows. And so you know this is an interesting plant. You look it up and then you find out that it is the unique dietary preference of an endangered species called the blue Carner butterfly. Okay, so the blue Carner butterfly is not like a pigeon or a rat or a deer that just eat whatever humans sort of leave out, right? Very well adapted. They are very specific. They will eat only this one kind of wild lupin. And you're a smart guy, right? You're a successful farmer, and you read a little bit about it, and it turns out that if you call the federal agency and tell them that you've discovered this food for this endangered species, they are going to prevent you from farming your land. So what do you think you're going to do? You might actually want to help the butterfly, right? You might actually like them. You might have noticed them eating the wild lupin on your farm. But notice there's a disincentive for you to call, right? Now, why is that? It's because as a farmer, your interest is now at odds with the interest of the blue-corner butterfly. They're exactly at odds. And in fact, this policy hasn't just happened with these beautiful butterflies. It's happened with dozens of species. As a result of the original 1,200, about 15 species have been removed from the list in the last decade since it was enacted. That tells you there's something probably wrong. But in fact, there's a policy that's now sort of colloquially described as shoot, shovel, and shut up. All right? Now, in this case, all we're not talking about animals, right? Not talking about the butterflies, we're talking about the lupin, right? Because as a farmer, it's your interest to make sure that you do not have an endangered species habitat on your land. And so, rather than call the authorities, you're very likely to just make sure it's not an endangered species habitat, not say anything. Shoot, shovel, and shut up. Now, no one thought, let's have farmers destroy endangered species habitats. What can we do to cause that? No one intended that. But that, over and over again, has been the effect of the policy. What's depressing is that members of Congress and bureaucrats and agencies and voters like ourselves, if we mastered the art of economics, could actually prevent these kinds of things. I'm convinced that if we can learn that intellectual discipline, we could prevent it. In fact, I'll simplify the art of economics for you in terms of a single so-called trillion-dollar question. Now, I'll leave it as homework for you to guess why I call this the trillion-dollar question. Remember, the art of economics consists in tracing the consequences of a policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. The trillion-dollar question is just this: and then what will happen? So if somebody says, let's implement federal rent control all around the country, you say, oh, and then that sounds nice, and then what would happen? Let's raise the federal minimum wage to $200 an hour, and then everybody will be rich. You say, that's nice. You want people not to be poor. And then what will happen? That's the trillion-dollar question. And if we could just learn to exercise that discipline, rather than practicing random acts of kindness, we can promote effective solutions that are not only well-motivated, but that actually help our fellow human beings. That is why good intentions are not good enough. Thank you very much.